South China Morning Post, 27th of September 2022. China's claim of debt forgiveness for restructurings by developing nations is undermined by problems with transparency. Economists said the lack of concrete data makes China's assertion that it outperforms other large economies in the globe in terms of the amount of debt it has postponed collecting from developing nations challenging to substantiate. The Chinese government wants China to rise to superpower status. Instead of waging war, they concentrate on achieving financial supremacy and dominance by making money their primary tool. China has provided loans to finance infrastructure projects throughout Africa and Southeast Asia for at least 10 years, mainly through its Belt and Road Initiative. However, recent credit problems in Laos and Sri Lanka have raised concerns about Chinese debt. According to James McCormack, Managing Director and Global Head of Sovereign and Supranational Ratings at Fitch Ratings, restructurings, such as debt cancellation and modified repayment conditions, have already occurred. The lack of transparency in the debt restructurings, which makes it harder for other creditors to determine what level of support they may need to offer to ensure the debtor country's external debt position is sustainable, is the most significant criticism the international financial community has leveled at China, according to him. Wang stated last week in Beijing that China has been doing its utmost to support developing nations as they seek to handle their challenges by the idea of collaborative efforts and equitable burden sharing. China offers loans to emerging nations' economies to build their infrastructure, which boosts trade flows of Chinese goods, makes money for Chinese companies, creates jobs for Chinese residents, and ultimately expands China's government's geopolitical strength and influence. According to Alicia Garcia Herrero, head Asia-Pacific economist at the French investment bank Natixis, China has advanced its July deal to restructure Zambia's debt while engaging with 30 other African nations. Exim Bank and the China International Development Cooperation Agency, two Chinese creditors, have suspended more than $1.3 billion in debt service in 23 countries under the G20 program, including 16 African countries, according to a list of cases tracked by the China-Africa Research Initiative at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. According to Sun Yun, director of the Stimson Center's China program in Washington, Chinese officials frequently waive zero-interest loans to developing nations and have even organized debt equity exchanges. This entails assuming control of the nation's strategic infrastructure. According to Scott Morris, senior fellow with the Center for Global Development, an independent Washington-based think tank, zero-interest loans are quite straightforward to write off as direct foreign aid, but they only make up a fraction of China's total and its policy banks expect to be repaid. However, Han Anje, an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong, noted that it is challenging to ascertain the amount of debt forgiveness China has granted because it does not disclose the terms of its initial agreements with developing nations. Since membership in the Paris Club would necessitate greater transparency, Garcia claimed that China has refrained from joining the decades-old organization of officials from 22 nations that aid in debt repayment. In 2017, protests broke out in Sri Lanka over the decision to transfer control of the Hambantota International Port to another party after Colombo could not pay back the financing China had provided to support its development. According to experts, when debtor nations' financial troubles worsen, other creditor nations and multilateral lenders like development banks may become interested. China might try to sweeten its accords if other countries are providing loans to African states, Han continued. In August, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that nations should have choices and balance them publicly in their competition for influence in Africa. Japan, the U.S., and China have all been vying for influence in Southeast Asia since the 1980s. This region is a political hotspot for investment and newly wealthy consumers. If China modified its loans, it might influence poor Laos, according to Thitinan Pongzudarak, a political science professor at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. China is the source of around half of Laos' debt, which includes financing for the China-Laos Railway. Laos has massive debt, according to Pongzudarak, with its total public and publicly guaranteed debt reaching 88% of its gross domestic product. As a result, the Southeast Asian nation's foreign reserves are almost practically depleted. Pongzudarak stated, if Laos enters sovereign bankruptcy, it makes China look bad on several fronts. It would be a negative example if China didn't assist Laos and would leave room for other nations to enter. He continued, referring to China's Belt and Road Development Strategy, that a worsening debt issue in Laos would further undermine Belt and Road credibility in other nations. Morris continued that China may reduce lending rates, lengthen payback terms, and securitize loans with collateral like minerals or earnings from infrastructure projects to prevent future debt issues worldwide. According to Morris, China assumed equity participation in the Lao Railway because it believed Laos would not be able to repay an equivalent value loan.